Puddle Lane, The Magician's Raindrops. The Magician's Raindrops. It was Saturday afternoon, and Sarah and Davy were out in Puddle Lane. They had made another wooden cart, and they were having races down the lane. They pulled the carts up to the gates of the magician's garden. Then they turned them round, climbed in, and raced back down the lane to the post at the other end. The first time they raced down, Davy almost hit the post. He pulled his cart to one side just in time. They had raced down the lane 10 times, and they had each won 5 races, when Mrs. Pitter-Patter opened her front door and looked out. "Sarah! Davy!" she cried as they shot past. "You're making too much noise. Go home and help your mother." Sarah skidded to a stop. "She doesn't need any help, Mrs. Pitter-Patter," she said. "She told us to come out and play in the lane." "Well, I'm sure your mother didn't mean you to rush up and down like this," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "She doesn't mind," said Sarah. "Well, I do," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "Go and play quietly somewhere else." She shut her door. "It is hot in the lane," said Davy, coming back pulling his cart. "Let's go into the magician's garden. Let's go and see if we can see any of those mice," said Sarah. They left their carts at the garden gates and went into the garden. They crept quietly across the grass and hid behind a bush near the hollow tree to watch for the wide-awake mice. They didn't have to wait very long. They had scarcely settled down when a little mouse came running along through the grass and looked down the mouse hole in the roots of the hollow tree. It was Hickory Mouse. Sarah and Davy didn't know his name, but they could see he was a wood mouse because he had a white front and a long tail. Hickory gave a loud squeak. A few moments later, 3 other mice came out of the hole to join him. They began to play hide and seek among the roots of the old tree. Sarah and Davy had been watching the mice for some time when Davy heard a faint sound behind him. He looked round. Tom Cat was creeping through the long grass. He hadn't seen Sarah and Davy. His eyes were on the mice. Davy gripped Sarah's arm. She turned and saw Tom Cat. Tom Cat crouched down, ready to spring. "Cat!" cried Sarah as loudly as she could. "Look out!" said Davy. The little mice shot back down the mouse hole. Tom Cat's head jerked up. He stared at Davy and Sarah. "Scat!" cried Sarah again. Davy waved his arm. "Go away!" he shouted. Tom Cat turned and ran back to the gates. He crept under them and ran off down Puddle Lane. "The mice will never be safe while that cat comes into the garden," said Sarah. Let's go and see the magician and ask him to help us to stop Tom Cat coming here, said Davy. As they walked towards the big house, the front door opened and the magician came out. We were coming to see you, cried Sarah, running up to him. She told him all about Tom Cat. We don't want to hurt Tom Cat, said Davy, but we want to keep him away from the garden. I'll try and think of something, said the magician, but it may take me a little time. But there is something you could do for tonight if you would like to. We would, said Davy. What is it? I'll give you some magic raindrops, said the magician. They will scare Tom Cat away and they won't hurt him. Wait here, I'll go and get them. The magician went back into his house. A few moments later he came out again, carrying a silver bowl. He put it down on the steps. Sarah and Davy looked in. It's only water, said Sarah. She sounded very disappointed. It's only water now, said the magician, but just wait a minute. I'm going to make magic raindrops. The magician picked up the bowl again and held it in his hands. He whispered something which Sarah and Davy couldn't hear. Then he put down the bowl again and snapped his fingers. At once the water began to bubble. The bubbles floated up into the air until there was no water left in the bowl. Then, as Sarah and Davy watched, each bubble dropped back into the bowl again. But the bubbles didn't break. They lay there all together in the bowl. They looked like shining raindrops. Soon the bowl was full of magic raindrops. Each drop was about as big as a pea. The magician picked up one of the raindrops and held it between his fingers. It had a long silvery thread hanging from it. Put these magic raindrops in the bushes around the hollow tree so that the threads hang down, he said. If Tom Cat touches one of the threads, it will stick to his fur and the raindrop will break over his head. He won't be able to get rid of it until he runs under the archway out of Puddle Lane. The raindrops don't look very big, said Sarah. There isn't much water in them. There isn't much at the moment, said the magician, but they'll grow. That's part of the magic. They'll be as big as balloons before very long. What about the other animals in the garden? Asked Davy. Will they get wet too? Water won't hurt them, said the magician, and the raindrops won't stick to them. They will only stick to Tom Cat, and the raindrops will only last for one night. They'll be gone in the morning. The magician gave the bowl to Sarah and went back into the house. Sarah and Davy looked in the bowl. The raindrops are getting bigger already, said Sarah. At least they'll give Tom Cat a bit of a shock, said Davy. Come on, let's put them in the bushes. Sarah and Davy took the raindrops and hid them in the bushes all around the hollow tree. No matter how high they put them, the silvery threads hung down until they almost touched the ground. By the time the bushes were full of magic raindrops, the drops were almost as big as tennis balls. Let's put some in the trees too, said Sarah. Tom Cat will never see them if they're up in the trees. Sarah and Davy reached up as high as they could and hid some of the magic raindrops in the branches of the trees. Let's hide and see what happens, said Davy. But at that moment they heard their mother calling. We'll have to go home and have tea, said Sarah, but we'll come back afterwards. They ran back to Puddle Lane. You mustn't be out too long, said the mother as they opened the front door to go out again after tea. You must be back before sunset. We will be, said Sarah. As they went out into the lane, the gate of the garden opened, and Peter Tall came out. He was wet from head to foot. Water was running down his neck and dripping off the end of his nose. Peter, cried Sarah, whatever happened? I was getting some sticks for my fire, said Peter. A great whoosh of water broke over my head. I'm so sorry, Peter, said Sarah. Oh, I'm all right, said Peter. Last time I came into the garden, I met a monster who puffed out fire. I had to jump into the lake. I was much wetter then. He went off into his house. He must have met the Gruffle, said Davy. We never go in the garden when the Gruffle is there. Well, be careful you don't touch the raindrops this time, said Sarah. You saw how wet Peter was. They went into the garden and across to the hollow tree. They are as big as balloons, cried Davy, looking at one of the raindrops. Let's watch what happens next, said Sarah. They hid behind a bush near the hollow tree. They hadn't been there long when they heard the gates of the garden open. Sarah looked round the bush. It's the Gruffle, she whispered. The Gruffle went over to the house, and after a minute or two, they heard him scrunching something. He was eating some bits of coal which the magician had left outside for him. He's coming this way, whispered Davy. The Gruffle came over towards them, breathing out little puffs of smoke and grunting to himself. As they watched, he moved under the hollow tree and touched a thread of rain. The great raindrop burst over the Gruffle's head. The Gruffle gave a loud roar. Flame shot out of his mouth. His head was hidden in a cloud of steam. He gave another roar and vanished. Sarah and Davy saw the cloud of steam move towards the gates and disappear into Puddle Lane. Everybody seems to be getting wet except Tom Cat, said Sarah. I'm sorry about the Gruffle, said Davy. He's afraid of mice. He wouldn't hurt them. But he did look funny, said Sarah. I wonder who the next one will be. I hope it's Tom Cat, said Davy. They waited, keeping very still. The shadows in the garden grew longer. We shall have to go home soon, whispered Sarah. Shh, breathed Davy. Look! The little dragon had flown onto a branch of the hollow tree. He was looking down at the mousehole in the roots. As they watched, a little brown head looked out of the hole. It was Hickory. He looked all around, but he didn't look up into the tree. The little dragon lifted his wings, ready to fly. Hickory came right out of the hole. As Sarah and Davy shouted a warning, the little dragon hurled himself down towards Hickory. His right wing touched a rain thread. The water from the magic drop crashed onto his head, knocking him to the ground. For 1 second, Hickory was too frightened to move. Then he shot down the mousehole, back under the hollow tree. The little dragon picked himself up and flew up into the air. He tried to shoot fire out of his mouth as he flew past Davy and Sarah, but he only managed a hiss of steam. He disappeared down Puddle Lane. The mice won't come out again now, said Sarah, and it's getting late. We must go home. I'm sorry that Tom Cat didn't come. I'm glad that the raindrop hit the little dragon, said Davy. That was even better than hitting Tom Cat. Sarah and Davy were upstairs getting ready for bed when they heard a fearful howl outside in Puddle Lane. They ran to a window and looked out. Tom Cat was running down Puddle Lane as fast as he could run. He was dripping with water, and he was pulling a giant raindrop behind him. The thread of rain was round his neck, and the raindrop was floating in the air over his head. Water was pouring down from it as Tom Cat ran along. The water poured down, but the raindrop didn't seem to be getting any smaller. Tom Cat disappeared down the lane, howling as he went. Poor old Tom Cat, said Davy. He must have got a shock. He must have been after the mice, said Sarah. The water won't hurt him. The magician said so. He's only wet, and the raindrop will fall off at the end of the lane. The magician's raindrops really are magic, said Davy. I don't think Tom Cat will go after the mice again, but I hope no one else gets wet. The raindrops will be gone by the morning, said Sarah. Sarah and Davy turned away from the window and went off to bed. A Dragon in the Mountains. This is a story about Irun and Sandella and other characters who live in the magical country of Zorn. Irun, Sandella, and the Quorn, the fire-breathing dragon. The magician sends a messenger to help the children when the city of Zorn is in great danger from a fire-breathing dragon who comes down from the mountains. Candletown. Can you find Puddle Lane?